Imagine slipping through a tiny hole in a frozen lake, entering a narrow, utterly dark passage filled with icy water, and descending over 400 feet or 120 meters. This is exactly what 5 brash Finnish divers did in February 2014. Things went well early on, but a series of cascading events changed everything in the blink of an eye. Then, as their friends' lives hung in the balance, the divers faced unimaginably gut-wrenching decisions. This is the horrifying story of the Plura cave disaster. Viewer discretion is advised. KÄNKÄNEN is a well-known Finnish diver who cut his teeth at the quarry. But he experienced his first underwater tragedy while diving with a longtime friend at another nearby quarry in 2013. Shortly after the two entered the water, Kai noticed that his partner wasn't moving and his regulator had fallen out of his mouth. Kai immediately pulled him back onto the ice, began resuscitation, and called emergency services. A rescue helicopter arrived shortly after that, but by then, his friend was dead. A post-accident investigation revealed that he'd simply forgotten to open the oxygen valve on his rebreather. Kai was distraught over the incident and vowed to give up cave diving for good. But by then, it had become a passion that he couldn't walk away from. Soon after that incident, Kai quickly returned to the water with friends and fellow divers Patrik Grönqvist, Jari Rotarinen, and VESA RANTANEN. Still, his timing couldn't have been any worse. Almost immediately, he witnessed another fatal accident over a shipwreck near Tallinn, Estonia. One of his fellow divers disappeared while descending toward the wreck that day. Rescue divers were called in to search for the missing man, but their efforts were unsuccessful. Later, Kai and 2 others discovered his lifeless body in about 230 feet, 70 meters of water. But even with 2 fresh tragedies, Kai still couldn't give up cave diving, and just a few months later, he began planning another dive. This would yet be his most dangerous, challenging, and technically demanding dive. Norway's Plura River originates in Lake Kalvenate and winds through the scenic Plura Valley. It's widely regarded as Northern Europe's largest water-filled natural cave. Still, even so, Norwegians didn't begin exploring it until the early 90s, because before then, the available diving gear just wasn't up to task. Then, with more advanced and robust equipment, divers were beginning to venture further into the cave than ever. In early 2014, Kai and 4 other Finnish divers were about to embark on another epic dive at the Plura cave complex. Kai would be joined by 42-year-old fireman Patrik, 40-year-old production manager Jari, and 33-year-old electrical designer VESA, and 34-year-old mechanical engineer Jari Yu. All 5 were certified cave divers and experienced technical divers. This meant that according to national and international standards, they were fully qualified to undertake such an ambitious cave dive that would take them more than 320 feet or 100 meters below the surface of the Plura River. A few years earlier, Kai and Jari had set an unofficial Finnish record by diving 688 feet 210 meters in the Halvala quarry in eastern Finland. In addition, Kai and Patrik had already traversed the passage that connected the Plura cave's 2 known entrances the previous fall. With so much experience under their belts, they were understandably confident that they could pull it off again. But this time, they'd do the traverse in the opposite direction. The initial descent to the Plura opening had to be made below the surface of a small pond. The plan was to break into 2 groups with start times staggered 2 hours apart. If all went well, they'd traverse in about 5 hours and be back home safe and sound late the following day. The men climbed into Jari's van on February 5th, 2014. The trailer hitched to the van, loaded with a snowmobile, underwater scooters, dozens of diving cylinders, and many additional odds and ends. During the road trip through Finland, Sweden, and Norway, the anxious divers pored over every detail of their plan to ensure the outing was safe and successful. Then, just a few hours from their final destination, the snow and ice-covered roads became increasingly slippery and treacherous. At one point, Jari barely regained control of the van seconds before it careened into a ditch. After the incident, the staggered occupants shared a few nervous laughs and acknowledged their good fortune before stopping for a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs. Then, nearly 16 hours after the journey began, they arrived at Fordbrew Farm early on February 6th. Before retiring to their rooms, They diligently carried the most sensitive gear into the garage so it wouldn't be frozen solid the following morning when needed. Afterward, Jari decided to go to bed while the others enjoyed some well-deserved beers. Before turning in themselves, they agreed to sleep in until 8 a.m. to ensure they got plenty of rest. By the time they woke, the temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and the sun didn't make its first appearance until 9 a.m. The men were divided into two groups, the first of which included Patrik and Jari. They'd enter the cave first, and 2 hours later, Kai, VESA, and Jari would follow them in the same direction. The staggered departures would allow the sediment stirred up by the first group to settle when the second group entered the cave. But more importantly, it would allow one group to help the other if something went wrong. As the 9th hour drew near, Kai, VESA, and Jari U began preparing the gear while Patrik and Jari H fired up the chainsaw and began cutting a hole in the ice-covered lake. When they finally breached through the thick layer of ice, they were pleased to discover the water was so clear that they could see the rocky bottom nearly 60 feet or 80 meters down. The divers were in particularly good spirits with top-notch conditions, ample rest, and full bellies. As they worked, Patrik took a video of himself and Jari H making final preparations. Then, as Jari zipped up the back of Patrik's dry suit, he asked if he thought they should go ahead with the dive. Jari responded by gesturing down toward the water with his right hand. The meaning was clear. We're going. Then, just a few minutes after noon, Patrik pointed his camera at the hole in the ice and Jari eased himself into the frigid water. Getting such a late start wasn't a great idea, but it didn't seem like a huge deal because the dive was only supposed to take about 5 hours. Having finished their preparations, Kai and Jari U arrived to wish Patrik and Jari H good luck moments before they fired up their underwater scooters and began descending towards the entrance of the submerged cave. The underwater scooters looked like gimmicky gadgets from an old James Bond movie. Still, they were essential tools because they allowed the divers to move quickly and cover more ground while conserving precious energy as they worked their way down the cave. The men also used closed circuit gear, or rebreathers, instead of traditional open circuit equipment. The difference is that with closed circuit equipment, exhaled gases aren't discharged into the water. Instead, scrubbers remove the carbon dioxide, after which a mixture of fresh oxygen, nitrogen, and helium are recirculated to the diver through his or her regulator. Known as the trimix, this vital 3-gas combination can be adjusted depending on dive depth, personal preference, and several other factors. But even with the latest and most advanced gear, the men had to be cognizant of several age-old risks, one of which was hypercapnia. Hypercapnia is generally caused when a malfunctioning rebreather unit fails to remove the carbon dioxide exhaled by the diver. This leads to dangerous buildups of carbon dioxide in the blood, leading to dizziness, disorientation, fatigue, and nausea. Closed-circuit rebreathing systems can significantly increase the time divers stay submerged, but they also have some serious drawbacks. Since they're more complex, they're also more prone to malfunction. And when not properly adjusted to each individual, the trimix can make divers feel more confident and sometimes mildly euphoric. These feelings can lead to poor decisions and unnecessary risk-taking. Patrik and Jari H had used rebreathers before, but they decided to carry a spare unit and extra cylinders in case their primary equipment failed. Now, inside the cave entrance, they gradually descended over more than 1,600 feet, 500 meters, before entering an 800-foot, 250-meter-long chamber that was primarily filled with water. After taking a moment to appreciate their remarkable surroundings, they continued down to a depth of nearly 420 feet or 130 meters. All around them were porous limestone walls with pockmarked crags, crevices, and shadowy side passages. Now fully committed and fueled by the adrenaline coursing through their veins, they approached the deepest section of the cave. Once there, they attached guidelines to a plate anchored to the wall by Kai and Sami, who had previously set it up in the cave. In addition to marking the date, the plate stated that it had been placed there by Finns and not native Norwegians. Next, the passage began a long ascent leading to the other cave entrance, or the exit, less than 330 feet or 1,000 meters away. Patrik and Jari could see the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, but they still had to pass through a particularly narrow section that made a tight 90-degree turn. Patrik went through first. but as he turned to the corner, he lost sight of the light from Jari's headlamp. This wasn't a surprise, but to be safe, he turned around and peered around the bend to make sure his friend was still close behind him. Patrik re-established eye contact with Jari, but he immediately noticed that the beam of light from his headlamp was moving up and down erratically. This was alarming because it was a universally recognized sign of a distressed diver. Patrik motioned and yelled for Jari to come toward him, but when his friend didn't move, he reversed and headed toward him instead. Now face to face just a few meters away from the narrow passage, Jari asked Patrik to move his scooter and spare cylinder out of the way because they were blocking his path. Patrik moved them to about 30 feet or 90 meters up the passage, but Jari still didn't move from his original position, and by then he'd become noticeably agitated. Patrik wasn't sure what was happening until he noticed Jari's scooter cord wedged in a crevice behind 2 rocks. Jari pulled it free with a mighty tug when he motioned to the cord and began inching towards his friend. Jari was finally unstuck and moving in the right direction again, but he repeatedly motioned for Patrik to give him the open circuit backup tank. Patrik gave him the regulator 2 or 3 times, after which Jari switched back to his own rebreather. But after this time, Patrik noticed Jari's regulator had fallen from his mouth. He then handed Jari his own regulator and pressed the purge button, but in such an agitated state, Jari inhaled too quickly and sucked in a large quantity of frigid cave water. When his face contorted into a horrible grimace, Patrik knew that there was nothing he could do to save him. Patrik was no stranger to divers in distress. He'd even personally seen and retrieved dead divers, but this was far more personal. Steadying himself on a nearby rock, he tried to remain calm while carefully considering his options. He knew that his life was now in danger too. First, he looked at the dive computer to see how long his ascent would take and how many stops he'd have to make along the way. To his horror, it indicated his ascent would take over 400 minutes, or nearly 7 hours. When he checked what felt like just a few minutes before, the estimated ascent time was just 120 minutes. As a rule of thumb, every minute spent at depths greater than 360 feet or 110 meters adds at least 10 minutes to the total duration of the dive. With this in mind, Patrik assumed that he'd spent about 25 minutes longer in the passage than he originally thought. In emergencies like this, divers are often tempted to ascend far more quickly than they should. However, by doing so, they significantly increase the risk of fatal decompression sickness. Now with his friend's body blocking the passage and a painfully slow ascent ahead of him, Patrik couldn't simply swim to the surface and tell the other 3 divers in the second group what had happened. Worse yet, he'd even given Jari some of his own precious oxygen. This meant that there was a good chance that he wouldn't have enough to last to the end of this excruciatingly long 400-minute ascent. Either way, he had no chance but to swim towards the entrance and adhere to the cave computer's ascent schedule as closely as possible. As Patrik began to swim away, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen to Kai, VESA, and Jari U when they reached Jari H's body in the cave, blocking the passage a few hours later. Sadly, he'd figured they'd probably all die, and if he beat the odds and made it out alive, he'd have to drive back to Finland by himself and inform his friends' families that their sons, fathers, and husbands were dead. Meanwhile, at approximately 2 p.m., Kai, VESA, and Jari U lowered themselves through the hole in the ice and began making their way towards the distant cave entrance. Kai insisted on being last in line because he wanted to be able to assist the others if something went wrong. The 3 divers made good time and reached the cavernous air-filled chamber approximately 20 minutes later. With help from the bailout cylinders left by the previous group, they figured they could make the rest of the traverse in as little as 4 hours. However, VESA was encumbered by the additional backup cylinders he'd brought against the wishes of the others who told him that he wouldn't need them. Now, at a depth of 410 feet or 125 meters, the cylinders prevented him from moving through the particularly narrow portion of the passage. And while he was stuck, one of his fins got hopelessly tangled in one of the guidelines. VESA removed some cylinders and Jari U untangled his fin, but the episode cost them an additional 5 minutes. This slight delay meant that their dive time had just increased by nearly an hour. and Kai and Yariu weren't happy about having to make additional decompression stops and spending even more time in the frigid water. Even so, they hoped they could make their way through the cave's narrowest point before starting a relatively uneventful ascent. Then, just after they started moving again, VESA heard a telltale distress beep coming from a nearby breathing apparatus. Just seconds later, he spotted Yari H's lifeless body wedged awkwardly in a 90-degree bend. He shouted to Kai and Yariu that Yari H appeared to be dead and that his body was blocking their way. Now they faced additional delays because they'd have to remove their gear to have any chance of slipping past him through the narrow opening. At this point, things got hazy, but everyone was clearly in shock, and Kai was already suffering from nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis can give divers an overwhelming sense of calm even during life-threatening incidents. On the other hand, it can impair judgment and motor skills and cause disorientation and panic. Kai wasn't sure if Yari H was dead because he wasn't thinking clearly, and communicating with his fellow divers was difficult to say the least. However, he did notice that Yariu was swimming peculiarly and switching back and forth between his closed-circuit and open-circuit bailout systems. Something was very wrong, and a few minutes later, his body became limp and lifeless. Even in his precarious mental state, Kai knew that he couldn't afford to hang around to help his friends who were at the very least in far worse shape than he was, and maybe even already dead. Then, just after moving away from the horrible scene, he too saw Yari H's body wedged in the passage. To make matters even worse, VESA was kicking fiercely trying to get around it. Kai didn't think VESA would make it, so he shouted for everyone to turn around and head back the way they came. VESA heard him, but he dared not turn around because he feared running out of air before making it to the surface. With full-fledged panic setting in, VESA's breathing and oxygen consumption increased rapidly. Kai had to make a split decision because the situation was becoming more dire by the second. He could either stick around and try to help VESA or leave him to his own devices and fend for himself. Kai ultimately chose the latter, and with that, he turned around and began descending towards the opening they'd entered at the beginning of the dive. He knew that the first 1-minute decompression stop had to be made at a depth of 330 feet or 110 meters, but each additional stop would be longer than the one preceding it. Kai wasn't sure if he'd have enough oxygen if he followed the computer-generated ascent schedule, so he decided to risk decompression sickness rather than dying a painful death by drowning. When he finally reached the long air-filled chamber, he considered biding his time there until rescuers came for him. With a little luck, the oxygen in the chamber could keep him alive for days. But if nobody else made it out of the cave alive, there was no telling when or even if a rescue would be initiated. Once again, he decided to keep moving. But when his underwater scooter died, his hopeless situation became even more untenable. In the face of such overwhelming odds, he couldn't help but dwell on the family waiting for him back home. What Kai didn't know was Patrik was completing his own multi-hour ascent on the other side of the passage. With rapidly diminishing battery power, he had to choose between heating his thermal vest or propelling himself forward using his underwater scooter. He usually chose mobility over warmth, and when he got cold, he kicked his legs and waved his arms to keep the blood flowing until his next stop. Meanwhile, VESA was making his own decompression stops not too far behind him. During his excruciating ascent, VESA was so guilty that he couldn't assist his stricken friends. By then, he'd been in the water for 6 hours, and like the others, he was reaching the outer limit of his air supply. Now the 3 men were making their ascension stops, unaware that the others were alive and doing the same. It seemed like all hope was nearly lost and the harrowing ordeal would never end. Then, 6 hours from the surface, Kai had little choice but to open the valve on his last air cylinder. He had trouble making out the tiny pointer on the gauge, so he wasn't sure how much air was left. Nearby, Patrik and VESA were running out of oxygen and no longer able to make all the necessary decompression stops. Even so, Patrik finally broke the surface just a few minutes past 9 p.m., about 90 minutes earlier than the dive computer's proposed ascent. Patrik's dive had lasted 8.5 hours instead of the original 5 hours they had expected. Exhausted, he sat down near the cave entrance to wait for VESA, who he hoped was still somewhere behind him. Rummaging through his friends' backpacks looking for something to eat and drink, he eventually saw the light from VESA's headlamp emerging through the darkness. 3 hours later, Kai emerged from the cave entrance as well and swam towards the surface of the ice-covered pond. He aimed his light at the layer of ice above him and began to look for the dive hole. But he instantly realized it had frozen over since the morning. Thankfully, he did find it and broke his way through the ice and pushed himself and his gear up and out of the water. By then, it was about 1 a.m. in the morning. His dive lasted an astonishing 11.5 hours, but with no sign of his fellow divers. Fearing the worst, he walked to the van, turned on the engine, switched on the headlights, and collapsed onto the floor. By then, Patrik and VESA changed into dry clothes and returned to the pond. After an eternity without sign of the others, they finally broke down and called Norwegian authorities. Then, sometime after 2 p.m., they noticed that the van was idling and the lights were on. Running through the frigid air and inky darkness, they found Kai shivering on the floor. Sure that he was the only survivor, Kai assumed that they were curious locals who come to investigate the mysterious van with foreign plates. Kai, Patrik, and VESA were immediately hospitalized while news of the deaths spread quickly. Even after a lengthy stay at a local hospital, VESA continued to have difficulty walking, and he was plagued by a mysterious tingling all over his body. Of the three, Kai suffered from the worst case of anxiety, but like the others, he was eager to return home to Norway as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the police investigated what happened before and after the ill-fated dive expedition. Investigators questioned the three survivors multiple times and ultimately determined what everybody already knew: that the two Yaris had died in a horrible accident that had quickly spiraled out of control. In addition, authorities had to figure out if and how the victims' bodies would be retrieved from the cave. They hired 3 English divers to plan and execute the tricky recovery operation with no other feasible option. Later that month, the Brits descended into the cave through the entrance. They discovered the 2 bodies exactly where the other divers said they would be, but they couldn't dislodge them and ultimately gave up because the operation was just too dangerous. As a result, local officials decided to leave the bodies where they were and close the matter once and for all. After details of the harrowing tragedy had been released, they hoped no one else would ever attempt to make the traverse between the 2 cave openings. However, when Patrik heard that the bodies wouldn't be recovered, he discreetly contacted a few diving friends to see if they'd be interested in helping him do it. Everyone agreed, and the group of determined Finns secretly gathered at the cave entrance on March 26th. The recovery operation had to be kept under the radar so local authorities wouldn't show up unexpectedly and put a stop to it. After a brief silence, they entered the cave from both ends and placed more than 24 bailout cylinders along the passage. In addition, they established an underwater habitat in which exhausted divers could rest while performing their decompression stops. Patrik and Sami retrieved the bodies of the 2 divers. VESA wasn't allowed to dive due to decompression sickness, but he assisted the operation from the topside. The following morning, the team notified local authorities that the deceased men's bodies had been recovered and needed to be transported away from the dive site. The otherwise clandestine operation ultimately drew much attention from local and national news outlets in Norway, Finland, and Europe. But although the recovery effort was against official orders, no action was taken against the rescuers. Remarkably, just a short time later, Kai, Patrik, and VESA were back at it again, loading their gear into Kai's van just before heading out on a multi-week cave diving trip in France and Spain. The trip had already been planned during the Plura cave disaster. They thought about calling it off and giving up cave diving for good, but as they say, old habits die hard. I want to say thank you for joining me today, and if this story moves you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next episode.